So, in the early 2000s, I had the privilege of working with the government in exile of Western Sahara. No one in this audience has probably heard of Western Sahara. Very few that I speak to have. It's a small country in northwestern Africa. In 1975, it was invaded by Morocco, and over 200,000 people fled their country into the inhospitable Sahara Desert in southwestern Algeria. They fled to refugee camps, which they set up, and they've been in those refugee camps, almost 180,000 people, for almost 40 years. The government in exile went to war, and eventually in 1991, the United Nations brokered a ceasefire. And part of that ceasefire was that the UN would set up a referendum on self-rule. That was part of the agreement. That has never occurred. So the Western Saharan people in exile are still living in the most inhospitable part of the Sahara Desert, which I had the good fortune to visit. It's also a war zone. To the north of the refugee camps is a 2,000-kilometre wall that was built by the Moroccans to keep the people in exile out of their country. And that has separated families for over 40 years. I was lucky enough to meet with the National Union of Saharawi Women. So Western Sahara went through a lot of major change, as did most of the countries in Africa in the 1970s. So they were the last country in many ways to decolonise. Part of that change was that they have a constitution which guarantees education and human rights for all their citizens. So in the refugee camps, which are very dusty, dry, where there's many desert sandstorms, and the sand isn't like we know it in Australia. It's very, very fine. It gets up your nose, it gets in your eyes, it gets in the food. So these people have been living in canvas tents for almost 40 years. They've been educated in different countries. They are supremely well organised. They are incredibly sophisticated politically. So the National Union of Saharawi Women run the camps. They are the backbone of the services. They look after the elderly, they look after the sick, they look after people with mental health issues who are traumatised by the war and what they've seen. They run the bakeries, and they run the fledgling gardens, although water is an issue in the refugee camps. It's very difficult to get and find irrigation. Water is flown in by the United Nations. So with a literacy rate of over 97%, they put many developed countries to shame. So as a white, middle-class Australian do-gooder, human rights campaigner, I went into this war zone. I was flown in, and I had the privilege of meeting these people and living with these people. The National Union of Saharawi Women are a group of feisty, strong women who have had rights for most of their life in exile in the middle of the desert, unable to exercise these rights. I went into a tent to have a chat, find out how things were being done, and look at what we could do in Australia and the rest of the world to support other people in the refugee camps. So there was about 6 to 8 women in their beautiful lohafas sitting around the middle of the tent pole, sipping mint tea, very hospitable, very kind, very loving. And we talked woman to woman. And after we went through the niceties, the leader of the National Union of Saharawi Women, this particular Walaya or refugee camp of Samara, turned to me and through our translator, Zorgan, said to me, I said, how can we help? And she said, please tell people about our country. She said, try to get places that we can't get to. Try to represent us and speak about our situation. She said, if we have no hope, and if all countries are friends of Morocco, and we do not have a referendum, we will go to war and we will die. And I know this to be a fact because there's 185,000 soldiers stationed along that 2,000-kilometre stretch of wall, and the Western Saharan army is a very small army, so they would die. She said, we would go to war, we would give up our lives rather than lose our freedom. And she said, we don't need papers or messages of threat. And what she meant by that was the wonderful statements and public letters that we write in diplomatic circles to try to get the United Nations and other forums to help the suffering of such people. She said, we don't need papers or messages of threat. She said, we need people to stand up for us and tell our story. And she said, because otherwise we will be happy to die. And she said, and once you would say that there was an ancient nation that walked upon this earth. So the honesty and the lived experience of this woman and the women there and the women running these camps had this profound impact on me. And at that time, I really felt gratitude and appreciation for my situation and my lack of awareness of how fortunate I am. I am a woman who's never questioned my right to be educated. I live in a country without war. I live in a wealthy country. I'm able to earn money and my children are able to live their dreams and they're able to express themselves. I'm able to attend a political protest and I'm able to have running water and I'm able to go and have a coffee wherever I want. I became profoundly aware of that and the difference between us and the life that I had by an accident of birth. I've had a life of privilege. I'm in a developed nation. I'm white. I'm middle class. I am privileged. That really hit me because these women were doctors, were engineers, were way more educated than me. Way more educated than me. Their sophistication and their collective organisation was way more sophisticated than I'd ever seen in my life as a community worker and a human rights campaigner. It made me think about my work and how I do my work, often thoughtlessly, in the area of social change or community service. I have to say that white middle class do-gooders, speaking for myself, have often been thoughtless in terms of our practice of work. We think that we'll just fix things up or give people this and that will make the difference. I actually started thinking about my quality of being with another person and the quality of compassion. And one of my favourite TED speakers is Joan Halifax. She's a Buddhist teacher and she's worked on death row. She speaks about compassion being the ability to stand strong but not be separate from that other person's suffering. And I think that in that tent, I felt I really was impacted by that other person's suffering. And it made me feel equal and it made me feel grateful. I then had the privilege of working with the Aboriginal community in Western Sydney. So once again, white, middle class, educated woman coming into Western Sydney. So first of all, I knew that I needed to get some help. So I had the privilege of working with elders, very generous Aboriginal elders in Western Sydney who taught me about cultural protocols and taught me about their experience. And so what the teams that I worked with developed was a way of working with the Aboriginal community, because I suppose many of you may not know that urban Aboriginal Australia has the highest concentration of people in Australia, in Western Sydney. So the disadvantage is huge in Aboriginal communities. One of the elders that helped me was Uncle Wesman, so gracious with his time. We know the stats. I mean, a lot of people here know the stats about Aboriginal Australia, who, in a way, are like an invisible people to white, middle-class Australians. We know that there's a huge gap in mortality. We know that 25% of the prison population are Aboriginal, even though the general population is only 2.5%. We know that 50% of people in juvenile detention are Aboriginal. We know that 28% of the children who are homeless are Aboriginal, yet they're only 5% of the general population. So there's all these stats that get trotted out, but what really impressed me was in Western Sydney, it was almost as if there was this concentration of disadvantage that we had all forgotten about that was completely invisible. But the other thing that absolutely impacted me was the daily racism that Aboriginal people experience and people of colour experience here in Australia. Here in Australia, where we've had a white Australia policy in 1901, we've come from a colonial, oppressive regime. The type of work that we started doing was aimed at a two-way commitment. So, we had funds, we had houses, we had teams of workers who could give material help and other sorts of support. But we knew that as a team, we needed to learn about Aboriginal culture. So it was a two-way thing. Our teams had the benefit of learning about cultural protocols from the beautiful elders of the 70 or 80 Aboriginal nations who represented Western Sydney. They took us under their wing, and as community workers, we decided we wanted to aspire to work to the values of Aboriginal people. So that is respect for elders, the family is all important, looking after our brothers and sisters, so the collective is incredibly important, respecting the law. So these are things that can inform our practice. So from over 30 years of working with disadvantaged communities, I was gaining so much. I have been profoundly affected by Aboriginal culture and the little I know. And the first thing that I had to do when working with teams of Aboriginal workers was to say, I'm a white woman, I don't know the Aboriginal experience and nor can I speak for Aboriginal people. But I can help give them some power back, give them some access so that they can speak for themselves. And believe me, as most of you would know, there are strong, amazing Aboriginal people around who have done so much for our culture and continue to do so much for all of us that I'm just humbled. I am absolutely humbled. So the qualities of compassion are what our team based our work on, and we were informed and taught by Aboriginal elders. Because of that, we were able to make a big difference in a small community, but it's only a very, very small difference when we look at nationally the whole challenge. One of the best things, though, was being able to connect with the positive cultural and spiritual sophistication of Aboriginal people. And once again, I felt humbled. I felt aware of all that I don't know and have never experienced as a white, middle-class do-gooder in Australia, in a first world or developed world. Compassion is something lived by women, I believe, and of course by men. But as women, we need compassion as caregivers, as initiators, as strong, courageous leaders. Compassion was something that I learned from my mother from a very early age. She gave me the values of social activism, of caring for others, and she was able to sit with people and be with their profound suffering. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. When I was in that tent in Sahara, the refugee camps, I was confronted by my inability to sit with the profound suffering of those people, partly because I had no idea, but secondly, because it is overwhelming at times. And I wept, I did weep, and those women saw that. And I felt embarrassed. But it was right that I wept. It was right that I wept, you know. So the compassion that I guess I would like to see more of in Australia, particularly amongst our leaders, is one where we don't separate ourselves from people's profound suffering, and where we use our compassion to then engage in activities that lessen that suffering. And once again, that's something from Joan Halifax, engaging in activities that lessen the suffering of others. It's something that I'm grateful to my mother for from a very early age, giving me those values. From a very early age, showing me how to behave. So, for example, when I was a kid, the best friends of my family made a racist joke about Aboriginal people. So this is in the 60s. This is before Aboriginal people even had the right to vote in Australia. Yes, this is before Aboriginal people were seen as human beings in Australia. And my mum, without even any thought, kicked that person out of our house and said, "It is not on. We do not have these jokes. We do not make these jokes." And I'll never forget it because it did create a bit of a stir. And to this day, I will not tolerate a joke, an aside, because it's an indication of how white middle-class do-gooders continue our privilege. It's an accident of birth. It's an accident of birth that I have wealth and education. So I guess what I take from the experience of being with women from the National Union of Saharawi Women, being with the aunts, the Aboriginal aunts, that have supported me, that have shared with me, that have opened their hearts to me, is that any work that is involved in social change, we need to have an open heart, an undefended heart. We need to have loving kindness. We need to be able to sit with that other person's profound suffering and not have it be separate to us. We can learn from this, and we can be with that person and with a whole group of people. I think that we need to have solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Western Sahara, the forgotten nation, and our brothers and sisters in Aboriginal Australia, the invisible nation. We need to have solidarity, and we need to have compassion. We need to have open hearts, and we need to be able to go beyond our privilege.